So good morning and welcome to our beginning vegetable gardening talk put on by the Master Gardeners of Alameda County. So this presentation will run for an hour and 15 minutes. And it's very nice to see the folks that have joined. We're excited to be presenting this to you. So we are recording this session, so please make sure that you are muted and that your screen is turned off. So my name is Deb Fries and I'm a Master Gardener and I am your Zoom host. So we also have on the call Michelle, and I'll let Michelle go ahead and introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. I am Michelle Young. I'm going to be monitoring your questions that you're going to be putting into the chat box. And I've been a Master Gardener since 2016.
And then lastly, I have the pleasure of introducing our presenter, Sam Foushee. So Sam has been a vegetable gardener in the Oakland, Emeryville, Berkeley area for the last 50 years. He received his Master Gardener certification in 2001 and has since done many talks and workshops on all aspects of growing vegetables. He never tires of the wonder of being able to grow delicious and nutritious food from a tiny seed. So Sam, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Deb. Thank you, Michelle. We're looking forward to spending this time with you, and we're hoping that you will get some good information and gain some confidence to embark upon growing vegetables, especially if you haven't done so before. So we're going to start off at the beginning. If you're planning to do a vegetable garden, the first thing you need to think about is where you're going to grow them. There are sort of three general ways that people usually grow their veggies. Some people have a space to grow them directly in the ground. So some people choose to, or they, for various reasons, like to grow in raised beds. And the third choice is in containers. I'm going to talk about the pros and cons of each. The growing in the ground has the advantage of it holds moisture better because you have less evaporation, and so things usually when you grow them in the ground won't need quite as much irrigation as they might in a raised bed, and especially in a container. The soil, and if you're growing in the ground, is usually you can have a deeper soil, so you can grow veggies that have deeper root systems. And often if you're growing in the ground, you just have more room to grow more stuff. There are some disadvantages though. One is that usually it requires more soil preparation, especially if it's a plot in the ground that hasn't been grown in before. Then it's going to take some good preparation in order for you to be successful. Also, you can't move that ground bed, so you need to use a bed that's already got good sunshine, a good exposure if you're going to have successful. Compaction can be a problem if you're going in the ground. If you're going in the ground, it's much easier to step into your garden bed, and when you do that, it packs the soil down, which makes it harder for the roots to grow. And I mean, you can get around it, of course, if you're really careful, but it's easier to do that in an in-ground bed. And finally, sometimes you might have to worry about contamination. If it's a place you haven't grown before in the ground, you might have to do some research and maybe use some testing to see whether the soil is okay for growing vegetables. And I will speak about that a little bit more. In raised beds, that solves some of the problems of the in-ground growth, an in-ground bed, because you can actually purchase good soil and fill your raised bed with it. And then you shouldn't have to worry about contamination, and you shouldn't have to worry about compaction, because you're much less likely to step into a bed that's raised above the level of the soil. The disadvantages to a raised bed is, of course, you're limited to whatever size you build. I grow in a community garden and my bed is 4x8, so it's pretty limited space. It dries out faster. If you think about it, a raised bed is really sort of a modified container, much bigger than most what we think of as containers, but it is still a container, and so it will dry out faster than growing in the ground. And the final disadvantage to a raised bed is that because your space is limited, it's harder to rotate your crops around to different section. And I mention that because most veggies, and especially veggies in the tomato, eggplant, cucumber family, they like to be, or you have better results if you're able to grow them in different soil from year to year. The diseases that attack those plants tend to linger in the soil for over the winter and sometimes over several years. And by being able to rotate them around, you get a little better results with the pathogen buildup in your soil. So there are some ways to get around that to a certain degree. I'll talk about that when we get to pest control. And then finally, containers. Lots of people grow in containers because they don't have anything else. They live in a condo or an apartment. There's no way to, they don't have space for a garden in the ground or in a raised bed. So they do containers. Containers can work quite well. They are more flexible in terms of the location because you can move them around. And that's especially true for sun, for getting the most light, the best light exposure, because the sun over the course of a growing season is going to move. And if you can move your plants with the sun, then you're going to get better light exposure. The disadvantages of growing in containers are that they are shallow, they have less soil, they dry out faster. So watering is much more crucial. They're much less forgiving in containers. You have to be sure that they're watered adequately. And they also use up the nutrients because the soil is, amount of soil is limited. The nutrients get used up faster. So it's very important that you fertilize if you're growing in containers. It's less important in the ground in raised beds, although still important. So we'll talk a little more about that later. And the overall thing that I want to emphasize here is that you need to think about your light requirements, whichever method you choose. Most herbs and vegetables like about 6 hours of sun a day. That's not a hard and fast rule because some things can do well with less leafy greens and root crops like beets and carrots and things like that can do okay with a little less light than that. But I use 6 hours as sort of a minimum rule of thumb. So now that you've kind of thought about where you're going to grow your veggies, let's talk about getting ready to plant them. Preparing and buying your soil, if you have to buy your soil, which you probably will, it's good to get a sense of how good your soil is, especially if it's in the ground or a raised bed that you haven't grown in before. So what are the properties that you're looking for? You're looking for a loose, preferably sort of dark looking, rich soil to get the best results from your plants, get the best harvest and have the healthiest plants. So a lot of times you can tell just by looking, and you certainly can tell to a certain degree, and you certainly can tell more if you dig down a little bit. If the soil is really hard and dried out and difficult to dig into, then that's a pretty good indication that it needs some amendments, because you want it, as I said earlier, you want it to be kind of loose and so that the roots can penetrate easily and the water can penetrate easily. So I'm always looking for my soil to look kind of like the middle picture, dark and kind of loose, and that's usually a pretty good indication that my plant's going to do well. And the secret ingredient, the one that I use all the time and highly recommend, is using compost to loosen up your soil, to make it richer with organic matter, and it'll have more nutrients. It will hold water better, and your plants will be happier. If you have the ability and the system for making your own compost, I feel like that's ideal. I belong to a community garden in Emeryville, and we have a very good compost system. That's what the compost I use in my community garden bed. However, lots of people don't have that, or you're thinking about it, and maybe in the future you'll start a compost system. You can buy compost. You can buy it in bags at any of the garden centers or big box stores. You also can purchase, if you have a big area you're growing in, you also can purchase it in bulk, which is much less expensive overall. However, you need some way to transport it back and forth for one of the landscape supply companies. So if you're growing in containers, I highly recommend purchasing a good potting soil mix. There again, you can get them at any of the big box stores or at nursery centers. What I will say about potting soil is I recommend not buying the cheapest one you see, because to a certain degree, I've always found that you kind of get what you pay for with potting soil. It's a more expensive potting soil by a more well-known company will usually be better quality, have better ingredients, and your plants will do better in it. So this is a fabric pot, which is a kind of container that I like a lot. It has a lot of advantages. They're very popular right now, or these days. And this one is filled with good potting soil, and you can see all those peas and veggies are very happy there. So you figured out where you're going to grow, and you've kind of planned your soil. If you're growing, let me say one more thing about contamination. If you're growing in the ground, if you're growing in the ground and you're at all worried that your soil could be contaminated, it's quite easy to get your soil tested these days. You can, if you go online and do a search for soil testing, you'll get lots of different places that do it. And typically what they ask is they charge you a fee, and I haven't done it in a number of years. I'm not sure what the current fees are, but it's not real expensive. If you and all you have to do is follow the directions, take a sample of your soil, you mail it to them, and then you they'll send you back a profile of what's in your soil, where you have anything to worry about, and what nutrients that you might add to improve your soil. So that's soil testing. So the next thing you need to think about, you got your soil all squared away for which way you decided to grow. And now the next step is to think about what you're going to grow. So there are basically two growing seasons in the Bay Area. Now, if you don't live in the Bay Area or California, you may only have one, real growing season. But here in the Bay Area and in much of the coastal area of California, we can actually grow in the cooler months quite well if you follow the if you know which things do well in which seasons. And in the center of the slide, there's a handout that we're going to send you that we did some years ago in Alameda County. It's this handout of vegetable and herb planting recommendations, and it lists things by cool season and by warm season. I'm sorry, excuse me. It's two-sided. The cool season things are, starting in the fall and through the winter into the spring. Warm season starting around now through the summer and into the fall. Today, we're going to focus on the warm season veggies because that's what we're coming up on. But I will go over the cool season ones, mainly because there are quite a few of them you can actually grow during the warmer months. And I'll point those out as we go along. The handout, as I said, will be sent to you in an email after today's session, along with some other information that we'll talk about later. So let's start with the warm season veggies. These are the common ones. They're not all of the ones that you might be interested in growing by any means, but they're the common ones that gardeners grow, and especially new gardeners. These are ones that tend to be most popular. Tomatoes are the number one veggie that most home gardeners like to grow for good reason. They are much more delicious usually when you grow them yourself, and it's just a very satisfying plant to grow. Peppers are very common. Sweet peppers on the top. These are jalapenos, hot peppers on the bottom. I find that in the Bay Area where I grow, I live in Emeryville, and around the Bay, I actually have better luck with hot peppers, even though they don't get quite as hot as they would in a hotter climate. The plants just do better. Bell peppers, you want a nice big pepper, and I've just always found that sweet peppers, while you'll get some, they just don't tend to be as big as they would if you were growing them out in the Central Valley or in a hotter climate. Another common summer veggie is squash. There's summer squash, which you harvest all summer long, and then there's winter squash, like these butternut, which you have to kind of dedicate some space to and let them grow all summer, and you don't harvest them until they ripen in the fall. So they take up a lot of room, and you have to think about that, whether you have the room to grow winter squash and whether you're willing to dedicate that amount of space for quite a few months before you actually get anything. Whereas summer squash, you'll be able to harvest, once they start producing, you'll be able to harvest some all year long. Other common warm season veggies, eggplant is another heat lover, like tomatoes and peppers. It does better in hotter climates. I found that some of the smaller eggplants, like this Japanese eggplant or other Asian eggplants, tend to do a little better in the coastal climates than do the big globe eggplants. And I've also found that eggplants in our climate, here close to the bay, are somewhat prone to diseases. There again, you don't have that problem as much in warmer climates. So it's kind of, if you really love them, try some of the smaller varieties. Cucumbers do well here. I never have much problem with cucumbers in our sort of marine influenced climate. Green beans do really well. There are lots of different varieties and different ways to grow them. And I personally prefer this particular green bean is a Romano bean, which is an Italian variety. It's flat. It doesn't really get strings. And they're just sort of buttery and delicious when you cook them. It's my favorite, but there's a lot of good green beans out there. And I prefer green beans that climb, climbing, or pole beans they're called, just because you get more bang for your buck. I think you can get bush beans, which means that they grow in a little bush-like plant, but you get less harvest and they take up a little more room than a green bean that grows up a trellis of some kind will. And then the three typical herbs that people like to grow in warm weather: basil, which again does best if you get a lot of warmth, but I have good luck with it in my climate. and oregano and thyme are two perennial herbs that grow year-round in and they do well in our climate. So those are just some of the common warm season vegetables. On that handout, there are more listed, and it gives you some guidelines on the handout of the best time of year to plant them, and also how to plant them, whether to use seedlings or plant them from seeds. So I think it'll be helpful to you, especially if you're a newbie and haven't done this before. I think it'll be a good guide for you to get off to a good start. I just want to quickly go over the common cool season vegetables and point out the ones that you actually can grow during the warmer months. Leafy greens like kale, chard, collard greens, spinach, and others, they will grow. Spinach, not so much, but kale, chard, collards, you can grow them in the warmer months. They tend to be a little more prone to pests when the weather gets warmer. You'll get some insect pests on them usually, but I'll talk about how to deal with that later. But I grow kale, chard, and collards all summer long. The Asian vegetables, which I'm a big fan of, bok choy, Japanese mustard, and others, they do best in the cooler months. So I don't try to grow those in the warmer months. Salad greens, all your lettuces, arugula, radicchio, those kinds of things. You can grow those in the summer months if you live in a marine influenced climate fairly close to the bay. If it's really hot where you're growing, they tend to want to bolt the seed. They want to make flower heads and seeds and not produce leaves anymore when it gets too hot. You can mitigate that to a certain degree by covering them partially with some kind of shade cloth, or build a little some kind of covering over them that gives them part sun during the day, and that will keep them going. I like to have my lettuce for salads year round. Peas are definitely a cool season variety for the best results, because what happens when they get in the warmer seasons is they get a disease called powdery mildew. You can almost depend on it, and that stunts the plants, and then the actual pea pods themselves mature too fast, and they just don't taste very good. So if you try to grow them in the summer months, they just don't do all that well. The cabbage family, broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, those sort of things are best grown in the cooler season. Although I have had pretty good luck with broccoli and cauliflower in the warmer months, especially if I start them in the early spring and harvest them before it gets too hot. They're like a lot of the other cool season vegetables, they tend to be prone to insect pests as the weather gets warmer. And they tend to, what you're eating with broccoli and cauliflower, especially, you're eating an immature flower head. That broccoli and cauliflower head is actually just the immature head, and it's going to burst into flower when the weather gets too warm. So in the cooler months, it slows it way down if you that process way down. That's why I find you do the best with broccoli, cauliflower, and cabbage in the cooler months. The root crops, carrots, beets, radishes, those all I can grow. I grow all of those in the summer months, and I think they do a little better in the winter months, but they do okay in the summer months. Garlic, onions, leeks, the things in the onion family, I definitely would plant in the fall and let them grow over the winter, because into the summer, and then you harvest them in the early summer. They take a really long time to get decent ones, like 8 or 9 months. And so if you plant them in the summertime, they just really won't do much. They need that long growing season in order to be successful. And a couple of herbs I only grow in the the cooler season, which cilantro and parsley, I find just do better when the weather's a little cooler and the warmer weather, they just, like a lot of other things, they want to bolt to flower and make seeds, and you just don't get the leaves. That is what you're going for. So I hope that that gives you a brief overview of the kinds of things you might think about growing in your garden for this coming summer. The next thing I'd like to recommend is that you think about the growing space that you are planning on growing, and that you actually make a plan for what you're going to grow and where. And I'm going to give you a few ideas about your plan. You'll see this is for my summer garden last summer. This is what I grew in my community garden bed last summer. So some of the things I think about are which plants are going to grow taller and which are going to be shorter, because that will affect how much shade is cast on other plants around them. So in general, this is a general rule of thumb. I like to grow my taller plants on the north side of my garden or the east side of my garden. And I like to grow the lower growing ones on the south side. I'm sorry, on the west side and the south side of the garden. That way, as the sun goes over the garden during the day from east to west, kind of like that, the taller plants don't cast a shadow on the shorter ones. If I planted the taller plants on the south side and the sun goes across like that, it's going to cast shadows on the ones that are behind them, and they won't get as much light during the summer. Now, this is a tricky kind of thing to do when you think back on what I said about rotating your crops, planting them in a different place in different years. I try to rotate my tomatoes around as much as I can in my small plot from year to year. So last year I planted them here. This year I'm going to plant them more on the southwest side and maybe more on the east side, so that there again, I'm trying to minimize the shade that they cast on other things. And it's helpful to have a plan ahead of time, just so you're less prone. One of the common things I think people do in the beginning is, without a plan, they go to the nursery and they look at what looks beautiful and they say, oh yeah, I want to grow this, I want to grow that. And it's just hard to resist. And so often I see gardeners in my community garden buy more things than will really fit on their garden, especially when they start getting bigger. And they buy too much of any one particular plant. And so they end up with too many. The classic thing that people overplant is summer squash, because when it's small, it looks like just a little teeny plant that, a 6-pack is fine. I'll just plant 6 plants. And then they quickly realize, as it starts to grow, that each plant is going to get enormous, and each plant is going to produce an enormous amount of zucchini. And so over the years, I've learned about what my wife and I eat, and I like to grow kind of what I know that we will enjoy eating, and the right amount. So having a plan gives me a better idea of how much space I have for what I want to grow, and I don't overbuy or overplant nearly as much as I used to when I was less experienced. So I hope that's helpful to you, and I do highly recommend a plan ahead of time. You'll have better results in the long run. So you have a plan, you know where you're going to grow, your soil is all ready, so you're ready to plant. There's a couple of different options, and as the years have gone by, more and more I grow all of my veggies from seed myself. There are a number of reasons for that. If I grow them from seeds myself, I I have a much greater choice of things I can grow. The nurseries, the big box stores, they just have a limited variety. And not that you can't get good plants, and not that it's not okay to start off there. It certainly is. But I do think in the long run, if you become a a gardener that enjoys doing it, and you'll want to grow more and more things from seeds yourself. It's just a miraculous process. No matter how many times you do it, it's just, it just creates wonder and satisfaction that I don't think you can get any other way. It's a little cheaper to grow from seeds too than going to the nursery and paying, $3.99, $4.99, $5.99 for a 6-pack. One little package of lettuce seeds, which is what's right here, will last me for years. I keep them in a sealed container in my refrigerator, and one package will last me years and years, and I'll get hundreds of plants out of one little package eventually. And this is the way I start seeds for things like lettuce and chard and kale and all those things. I always use these little 6-packs and start them. I just fill them up with soil. I plant seeds in each little cell, and then the seeds sprout. And as they grow, I thin out, so there's down to 1 or 2 seedlings left in each 6-pack. And then I will transplant them up into a larger 6-pack. Oops, sorry about that. So that there's one lettuce plant in each cell until they get big enough to put into the ground. So that's my method. And the Master Gardeners actually have a little handout called Growing Your Own Vegetables from Seed that talks about this methodology. And it's available on our website, which I will talk to you about a little later. There are certain plants that prefer starting the seeds directly into the ground. They just do better than putting them in a 6-pack and transplanting them. Beans are a good example of this. These are some scarlet runner beans that I planted. If you plant them directly in the ground and let them germinate there, they're just stronger, and I just find they do better in the long run. There's a few other vegetables that are like that, and it mentions that on that handout, vegetable and herb recommendations. It mentions which ones you'll usually have better results with starting them in the ground. Doesn't mean you can't start them from a 6-pack, and you can buy beans, especially green beans at a nursery that are started, that are big like this, and they will do okay. You'll get beans, they'll do okay, but I just find that in the long run, they're a little stronger if you start them in the ground yourself. So what about purchasing seedlings at a nursery? Some of the advantages of that is you don't have to plan ahead like you do here. I had to plan ahead for like 6 weeks or so to have nice, big, healthy lettuce seedlings to grow here. And if you want to and can do that, it's very satisfying. But it is a whole nother step. So you can buy all of these things in a nursery, and you don't have to plan ahead. One common thing that happens in nurseries that I want to warn you about is that when you buy a 6-pack of lettuce, say like this one over here, at a nursery, usually there will be multiple plants in each one of these little cells. There, in the case of lettuce, I've seen lettuce that might have 10, 12, 15 plants all in this one cell, because the grower, what they did is they filled it up with growing medium, and they sprinkle a bunch of seeds in, and they just let it grow. And then they took it to the nursery store or the big box store, and they sold it with all these little plants. It's just easier for them, because it does take time a lot of time actually, to thin out excess seedlings when you plant a number of seeds in a particular cell. So that said, you can, if you buy a 6-pack at a nursery and it has multiple plants in a cell, you actually can separate those individual plants and plant them in different holes. And if you do it carefully, you'll get more bang for your buck. You'll get a lot of plants from one little cell. So you buy a 6-pack and you could end up with 20 or 30 plants if you separate them out. And you can give some of those plants to other people. You're not going to probably be able to grow them or want to grow them all yourself. And if you do separate them out, the other advantage of separating them is the ones that are left will do better if they're not all crammed together with other plants of the same type that are competing with them for water and nutrients in your soil. So the individual plants will do better if you separate them. So you've got your plants and you're ready to plant. So this is a way that I've developed over the years for planting seedlings that I find works extremely well for me and other people in my community garden. So I've got a little 6-pack of lettuce seedlings here that looks like romaine that I started from seed. I'm ready to plant it in the ground. They're big enough now. So the first thing I do is I dig a hole where I'm going to plant a plant, and then I get some compost from my community garden compost, and I put in a handful or two into that same hole, and then I kind of mix it together. Then I fill that hole up with water so it's nice and muddy, and then I take the seedling out of the 6-pack and I put it right into that muddy hole and pack the soil around it. And by doing that, what I find is that I'm minimizing the shock on those tiny little roots. From when it comes out of the 6-pack, you'll see these little white roots that have been growing in there. And I want to get it into that muddy medium where it gets lots of waters and nutrients right from the get-go. If you plant this little seedling into dry soil, and then you take your watering can and water it, you may get that same consistency, or you may not. The water may not get down to the roots nearly as well. I've seen that happen many times to my community gardeners that didn't use this method. They just dug a hole, stuck it in, put the dirt around it, and then watered it with a watering can or a hose. And I went back later and I noticed that their plant had all dried out because they didn't get enough water and nutrients down to the root zone of the plant. And then finally, I always like putting a little extra compost around it for mulch. Compost also feeds your plants. It's a kind of low-grade fertilizer, so it doesn't overfeed them, but it feeds them, and it definitely enriches the soil to makes the soil hold water better, makes it easier for the roots to grow. And then the final thing I do is I always mulch around the plant with something that's going to keep it from drying out as much. The compost helps a little bit. I use straw because it's easy to get, and I put straw around my seedlings, and that really helps keep it the water in, and it gives my seedlings a good start. So that's planting your seeds and getting them in the ground and getting them going. So you've got your seeds, your plants in the ground now. They're starting to grow. You're getting all excited, as well you should be. And the next thing you need to think about is how are you going to water? So watering is it's somewhat of an art. You get better at it the more you do it. You sort of learn how much is a good amount of water to put down for your plants. These are just some suggestions to make that easier. You're gonna, if you're watering by hand, like with this hose, I highly recommend watering slowly. So what I do when I'm doing this is I turn on the nozzle. I just have a very light spray. I put it near the plant so the water is going, it sort of goes around the base and soaks down slowly into the root zone. If I water fast, if I just take it, turn it on hard, squirt some water here, chances are what's going to happen is the water is going to wet the straw and maybe the top of the soil a little bit, but it's not going to have time. There's not going to be enough water to get down deep. And so the roots themselves aren't going to get all the water that they need. And while I'm watering like this, I just leave the hose there for a few minutes, let it run, and then I can go be doing some weeding or some harvesting or pruning or whatever other things need to be doing while it's watering. And then I would move it to the next plant or the next area and keep doing that until my my plants are well watered. In order to know whether your plants are getting enough water, there's a couple of different good techniques. You can always pull back the straw or whatever mulch you have and just dig down with your hand or with a trowel and just see how dark and moist the water is down, 4 to 6 inches, and that will definitely give you an idea. And if it's dry down there, then hey, I better give this guy a little more water soak in so it gets down. Another great little tool I've found is a moisture meter. This is one that I see commonly in nurseries and Home Depot and places like that. And it is handy because it gives you a little reading of how moist your soil is. It has a prong that goes down into the soil. It measures right on the tip. So if you push it down 1 inch, you're measuring 1 inch. Or push it down 6 inches, you're measuring at a greater depth. And the dial will say dry all the way to wet. And for most things, you want it to be kind of in the middle. And that's a kind of handy rule of thumb for how moist you want your soil to be for most plants, most veggies you'll grow. So a moisture meter. Another good thing to remember when you're watering with a hose is try not to get the foliage wet, because that will make the conditions more ripe for diseases. They like a lot of diseases do better when they, especially at night. You never want to hand water and get your foliage wet later in the day. If you do get foliage wet, you want it to be early in the day so it has plenty of time to dry before the nighttime temperatures. Overnight wet foliage is just allows the diseases that will attack a lot of different vegetables to grow and thrive. Okay. Now, a common way to water nowadays, and one that I highly recommend, is drip irrigation. You may be familiar with it or even have done it before. The advantages to drip is that you're not wasting water. You're not going to you get almost no evaporation like you get from hand watering with a hose. So it's more water efficient. And while the drip is running, I mean, if you can, at my garden, we have it on a timer, so it just runs automatically. If you, you don't have to worry about watering, it just does it for you. And it waters your whole bed at the same time. This is an example of a drip system we have in my community garden. The water comes in a 1/2 inch drip line. This is called the main line. It comes in from underground from a PVC pipe that we installed years ago. And then in the actual bed, we run this is a 4 foot wide bed. We run 3 1/4 inch drip lines that have these built-in emitters every 6 inches. And they drip, when it comes on, they drip the water straight down into the soil. In fact, if you look at it after the drip is run, gosh, there's hardly any. You don't see much water from the surface. The surface still stays dry, except you'll see a little bit around where each little emitter dripped down. But what happens underground is the water goes down. I'm sorry, keep doing that. The water goes down in underground, and underground the water spreads out. It just spreads out underneath. And so the plants that you plant there, their roots will reach for the soil and reach for the water in the soil, and then the soil, the soil itself the water just spreads in the soil underground. So, and you can see that if you have one of those moisture meters, you can see it. If you kind of poke around, you'll see that the soil looks dry on top, but when you poke it down, it's still plenty moist underground. Even, not that, even in the areas that aren't all that close to the actual drip line. So it works quite well. The only times that I hand water things that in my community garden bed is when I plant those new seedlings, like the one that I showed you. When I plant them, I often will hand water them for the first few weeks, every few days, because I know the roots haven't grown enough to get down into the soil that's being watered by the drip lines adequately. So it's just I want them to get big enough that then the drip lines can take over. Here's an example of drip lines in a container. You can use drip lines in a container also. This is my little fabric pot, and I have both a drip line that has those emitters in it. I also have a little sprayer that I use because I planted some seeds in here of cilantro, and I want to be sure they stay moist while they're germinating. So this line just shoots out a little circle of spray when the drip irrigation system comes on, and it makes sure that the seeds stay moist. Once they get big enough like this, I can turn the sprayer off, and I have because I know then the drip lines are providing plenty of water for the roots have gone down deep enough. Maintaining your garden. So things are growing. So now you want to maintain what you have going. Some good things to remember in terms of keeping it going over the long haul is that vegetables, what you're normally eating when you eat a vegetable is you're eating a part of the vegetable, either a root, a flower head like in broccoli, a root like carrot or onions, a seed pod like beans, or the actual fruit of the plant, like in a tomato. That's the actual fruit that you're eating. And so they're less forgiving in the sense that than an ornamental plant. They require a little more attention and care because you only have a smaller window of time to get what you want. So you want to pay attention so that you get that part of the plant that you're going to eat, and it's going to be in good shape and healthy. So it just takes extra attention. And if you do neglect them, you're going to get less of a yield. You're going to get, and it's just not going to taste as good. They're just not going to be as nutritious, and they're going to have more problems with pests and things if you don't pay attention to them while they're growing. You can't just plant them and then leave them and not pay attention to them. So they need regular water, whichever system you choose. If you plant seeds in the ground and you get a bunch of little plants, you're going to need to thin them out so they're not too close together and competing with each other. If you have things like squash, especially like that winter squash I showed you, and beans, that you're going to need some kind of trellis or stake probably for things that climb so they don't spread all over the ground, because they take up a lot less room that way. Plus, usually if they're growing on the ground, they're more likely, you're more likely to get pests and diseases on the plant and the fruit itself. And if you do have pest problems, you're going to want to remove, or disease problems, you're going to remove those veggies so that it doesn't spread to other plants. And you're going to want to control the weeds. You want to weed regularly because those weeds are going to be taking away water and nutrients from your veggies. The mulch is very important, as I said earlier, for keeping the weeds down, for conserving water, and for keeping the soil cooler. Most vegetables like cool soil and warm leaves. They like the sun to shine on their leaves, but they don't like the soil around them to heat up. It's not good for the roots. And you want to keep your soil healthy as you go along. Here you can, as things start to grow and mature, you can add a little bit of fertilizer if you choose to buy some. Personally, I use our compost from our compost system, and I rarely add any other fertilizer. But you can add some fertilizer for things that, like tomatoes are a good example, because they are very heavy feeders. They take a lot of nutrients out of the soil. I like the organic fertilizers that are made from organic materials of one type or another, because I feel like they do a better job of feeding my plants appropriately. And then I want to say just a couple of words about harvesting. Harvesting is a something that you need to think about in order not to waste food, and also in order to get your things you grow, you want to get them right at the right time when they taste the best and they're most nutritious. So you often have to harvest a lot. I see in my community garden, sometimes people forget to come harvest and things just go to waste. And that really is a shame. So tomatoes, you can harvest them when they're red, wait till they're red on the vine, and that works great. Over the years, I've kind of gone to harvesting my tomatoes when they're just turning color, but not all the way to red, because I found that I can take them home then, put them on the kitchen counter, and they will ripen just as red and taste just as good as if they ripen on the vine. And I have fewer problems if I do that. Sometimes birds will pick at a ripe tomato. We have a rodent problem. We have a rat problem at my community garden. And sometimes they will come in at night and they will eat a little bit out of a real ripe tomatoes. If I pick them before they're fully ripe, they usually don't bother them. And so I just find it works. Methodology for tomatoes works well. Summer squash is there again, it's a classic example of people not harvesting them soon enough. They taste better when they're small. And so I harvest mine when they're, kind of the size you buy at the grocery store. And then cucumbers, the same thing. I don't want them to get too big. They just taste better. When they get too big, they get more watery, the seeds get bigger. They taste better when they're smaller, like the size you'd buy at a grocery store. So don't let them get too big. Green beans, there again, I like to harvest them when they're relatively young and tender. And when in season, I harvest every day because they grow so fast, and I don't want them to get so big where they get stringy and the seeds in them get too big. So and things like kale, chard, lettuce, all the leafy greens, if you're growing them, when I harvest those, I pick the large leaves from around the outside edge of the plant, and then I just let it keep growing. Lettuce the same, kale the same, and you'll get a long harvest over weeks and months, even depending on the time of year, if you do it that way. I never pull out the whole plant. I want to get a steady supply, and my rule of thumb is never pick more than about a third of the leaves at one time, and then you will still have plenty of leaves left to photosynthesize and produce more leaves. So I'll speak just a minute about pests. This is called the Pest Note Index. The UC has a service called a department called the Integrated Pest Management Department, and they do all this research on pests and diseases. And they publish what are called pest notes on practically every pest or disease you could think of that you might encounter in a garden. And it's all online. And this index just shows you all the ones that are currently available. It gives you the website. You can go there. You can download a pest note that kind of gives you, it's usually several pages. It gives you all you would ever want to know about that particular pest. But the main thing you're interested in is how to deal with it. It also has a limited version, a shorter version called a quick tip or pest note card that just gives the essentials, all available online. A couple of things you need to remember though is usually you should not need to use pesticides or herbicides in a home garden. It's just not necessary. It's not good for the environment. And a little damage to your veggies is okay. You know, share and share alike. You'll still get plenty of good stuff to eat if you're willing just to accept that you're going to have a few pests and they're going to do a little bit of damage, but you're still going to get most of the product yourself. These are some common strategies that I use for that are good for multiple problems. A good strong spray of water will often wash off pests and also sometimes the spores of diseases that will help keep your plant healthy. If you do that regularly, often that will take care of a lot of problems. Here's a squash plant that got that powdery mildew disease I was talking about. So I just pruned off all the leaves that were infected, and that slows it way down. And I just left the healthy ones, and I just keep doing that. I still get some squash, and the plant lasts a lot longer. And then finally, if it's really badly infested, like this, this looks like a kale or a collards or something that has aphids very heavily infected, I would just pull this puppy out, throw it in the green bin, and start over. And that would hope that the next time, usually it would be a little later in the season before it's ready. And often these plants will not get the pest so much depending on the time of year. And then finally, there are a lot of beneficial insects out there that will help you handle pests if you encourage them to come to your garden. And in that pest note index, there's one of those quick tip cards that you can download that shows a lot of the or most of the common beneficial insects that are available in our area or that live in our area, and how to plants that you can plant. There's another card that shows you plants you can plant that will attract them. Things like sunflowers, or if you have herbs like these chives or oregano or thyme or any of the herbs that flower, if you let them go to flower, that will also often attract these beneficial insects. And once they're in your garden, they will tend to eat a lot of those pests. For instance, this is a kale plant, I think, that had a lot of aphids on it. And the beneficial insects that were in that garden actually ate the aphids. And this is we think was a predator wasp that basically mummified the insects. So it helped out kill the insects so that they didn't do so much damage to the plant. So beneficial insects are a great strategy to think about. And then the final thing I wanted to speak about is thinking ahead. So you've been growing your summer garden. You've gotten a lot of good stuff, but a lot of the plants are reaching the end of their life cycle. You're not getting much anymore. I always like to think ahead about what I'm going to plant next, because I like to keep something growing all the time if I can. So one technique is what I call succession planting. This is an example of cilantro done in this method. What I did is I grew a little patch of cilantro here. This is pretty mature, I can pick it. A few weeks later, I planted some more seeds and grew some more. And then a few weeks after that, I planted some more. So over time, I can pick this, and then when this is done, this will be getting time to pick. And then when that's done, I can, this should be getting big enough that I can start thinking about planting. So small plantings at timed intervals rather than planting everything at once. Another technique is you can, as soon as one plant goes out, you can prepare your soil again and then plant something else that's appropriate. So this is my community garden bed at the end of the growing season or near the end. And my zucchini plant is still growing, but I pulled out the tomatoes and things, they were done. And I planted some cool season veggies here, lettuces, kale, chard, because I know they will keep growing right through the fall and possibly even through the winter. And I also planted what's called a cover crop here to enrich my soil, which I grow in the wintertime. And I know that will last all through the winter. So that's kind of planting in succession to keep things going. And the final thing you can think about is same crop, but planting different varieties that will mature at different times. So this is a cherry tomato that I know is going to get ripe sooner. And this is a beefsteak that I know is going to take longer. So I'll be able to have a longer period of time where I'm harvesting tomatoes. So thank you for being with us. We hope we got some information and suggestions that will be helpful to you in having a very successful garden. And now, in just a minute, Michelle is going to go through as many questions as we have time for that we hope will be helpful to you also.
Thanks, Sam. So we have a few questions and probably more than we're going to have time to answer before our finish in about 3 or 4 minutes. But can you talk about how much compost is actually required for a container?
For a container, I'm not sure if you mean compost or potting soil. For a container itself, you would want to use potting soil, but then if you want to enrich that potting soil over time with some compost, I would just, if you buy a good potting soil, it's going to have fertilizer in it already, and it's going to be loose. It's going to have a good texture. That's how they're designed. If you want to enrich it as time goes by, as it starts to use up its nutrients and maybe gets a little more compacted, what I do is I just add compost. You know, I might add, depending on the size of the pot, I might do a covering of the top of the pot of the soil with compost, and I might mix it in a little bit with the top inch or two of soil in that pot. And then when I water it, the nutrients will leach down into the soil. So it will serve as both a fertilizer and a soil amendment for what's already in the pot.
Great, thanks, Sam. So cool weather crops in the summer.
Yes.
The temperature of the air, or is it the sunlight that has the effect that on the plants?
Good question. It's more. I think it's more the temperature of the air. When it gets really hot, like if you're getting 80 and 90 degree days where you live, those cool season varieties are just not going to be happy. They're going to want to start making flowers because they know that you know that warm weather means that that their growth is speeding up, and when their growth speeds up, they know that they're going to want to start making flowers and seeds so that they can keep their life cycle going. So I think it's more the heat than the actual daylight. Although some varieties, some vegetables do by the number of hours of daylight, they do speed up their growth pattern. They do want to. That is a factor, but I think it's more the heat.
Okay, all right. So we're talking about seedlings. I had a couple of questions. I'm going to see if I can combine them into kind of one topic. Growing seeds in the 6-pack, inside or outside. This person said that their seedlings were growing very tall and weak when they were inside. Could it be better outside? And what does it matter what kind of soil you use when you're starting seeds versus putting it in the pot?
Yes, so good question. So the best soil to start with for growing seedlings is a soil starting mixture. You can buy them at any nursery or hardware stores. It's called uh, uh, soil starting mixture. And the reason for that is that the soil starting mixture does not have any nutrients in it like a potting soil, although potting soil works okay for starting seedlings. But soil starting mixture is also sterile, so you're not going to have any problems. There's not going to be any kind of disease in that mixture that's going to start off, that's going to damage your fragile little seedlings when they first come up. That's what I use. That's what I recommend to people. Although, as I said, a good potting soil is probably going to work for you just fine too, if that's what you have. And then the second part of the question was where the reason that when you start seedlings, the reason they get tall and leggy is they're not getting enough light. So it's very important when you start your little seedlings that they get enough light to grow strongly. If they get weak, if they don't get enough light, they grow tall and they're weak. The stems are weak and they just never will do well. So I like to start my seedlings in a sunny window. I happen to have one that I can start them in, or you can start them outside where they get some sunlight during the day. I would say, you probably need at least 3 or 4 hours of sunlight in order for the seedlings to get off to a good start and not get leggy on you. And if you have a window that gets afternoon sun or western exposure, then that should work pretty well for starting seedlings.
Thanks, Sam. And in respect to time, I'm going to cut it off there. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. I apologize that we didn't have more time for your questions. I know you had some good ones. And so thank you very much. Appreciate you being with us today, and happy gardening.